It's my pleasure to introduce Sharon Nepstad, Chair and Professor at the University of New Mexico. If you do social movements and nonviolence, you know the work of Professor Nepstad. Her book, Nonviolent Revolutions, Civil Resistance in the Late 20th Century, won the Outstanding Book Award in 2012. Religion and War Resistance in the Plowshares Movement won the Outstanding Book Award in 2008. That's the ASA Peace and War section. Then there's Convictions of the Soul, when that was the first time I read her, and it was a great book about the Central American Solidarity Movement. She also has edited with Lester Kurtz, Nonviolent, Violent, what did I write here? Nonviolence and Civil Resistance. Did I get that right?
I think so.
Close enough. Numerous chapters, numerous articles. It's a delight to introduce Sharon Nepstad.
Thank you, Hank, for that really generous introduction. And I want to say thank you not only for envisioning this conference, but doing all the logistical work and the organizing. We study social movements, and we know when a campaign or a protest happens that there's been weeks and months of work behind the scenes to make it happen. So you are the elevator of this conference, and I'm grateful for both the opportunity and all the work that you've put into it. I had a conversation yesterday where I was saying it's sometimes surprising where our research interests lead us. And I am surprised at myself that I'm here today to talk about security force collaboration or disengagement in nonviolent movements, because I never anticipated studying the military. For 20 years, I've studied social movements and movements that use nonviolence. So I'm going to talk today about the military, and I got interested in it because as I was doing my research on nonviolent revolutions, it became clear that what security forces do have a big influence on the outcome. So I've been writing about it for a little bit, and I was very surprised when security studies and military studies people got interested in this topic. And I was even further surprised 2 years ago when the Turkish military contacted me and asked me to attend a conference that they were holding on how to stop civil resistance movements. And they thought that my expertise on defections would help them. And my first reaction was absolute horror, like, well, how has this happened? And then for a moment I thought, this could be fascinating to go and hear what the military's approaches are to trying to stop these movements. Wasn't brave enough to take on that spy role, but I am still writing about defections and the role of security forces in nonviolent movements. And the reason I'm writing about this is because obviously this really matters. It has a powerful influence on the outcome of these kind of so-called people power movements. And in fact, my friend and co-panelist here, Erica Chenoweth, in her 2011 book with Maria Steffen, they found that civil resistance struggles were 46 times more likely to usher in regime change if the military defects. Because of the predictive power of this factor, there have been a number of studies trying to understand why and how defections occur. But what surprised me is in this growing body of literature, the value of security force defections is almost never questioned. And I think we do need to question this. So I pose two questions in this paper. The first is, are there any negative consequences to defections for a civil resistance movement? And secondly, are the defections the best option? Or is it better to encourage security forces to respond in other ways? I use 4 different case studies of revolutionary contexts to examine some of the problems that can happen when defections occur and to explore some of the alternatives that exist. And based on those 4 case studies, I make the following arguments. First of all, rather than promoting defections, civil resistors should be encouraging security forces basically to refuse orders to repress or to interfere with movement campaigns in any way. So what I think is a better strategy is to have basically the military become neutral, to withhold their sanctioning power from the state, but to not side with the movement. And my second argument is that I think civil resistors and the academics who study them have placed far too much emphasis on defections for the goal of removing an incumbent political leader, and far too little emphasis on transforming military institutions and culture. And what I'm referring to here is really what Gandhi called the constructive program. So in Gandhian approaches, there are always two components. On the one hand, you resist civilly those institutions and practices that are oppressive and unjust that you want to remove. But, he argued, you must simultaneously be doing what he called the constructive program, building new institutions or transforming existing ones to be compatible with the long-term goals of the movement. And I'm arguing that these civil resistance struggles have done very little of the constructive program, and without this, the consolidation of democracy in the post-revolutionary phase is going to be very difficult. So let me start by then talking about what are some of the problems associated with defections. Very clearly, one potential problem is that defectors can take their weapons, regroup, and launch an armed struggle against the state, and that transforms a nonviolent conflict and struggle into a violent one. A second potential problem is that security forces can usurp the movement's momentum and impose their own agenda, which may not be consistent with the movement's own goals. And then the third potential problem is that security forces can feel free in the future to continue using their power to overturn other leaders, including democratically elected ones. So obviously there are potential problems with defections, but what are the alternatives? What can movements do to encourage other responses that would not have these types of problems arising? I use the spectrum to categorize a variety of different responses. And of course, one thing that movements or that security forces can do is to remain loyal to the state, to carry out orders, to protect the state from the movement. But there's a whole variety of other responses. So as you move to the right on the spectrum, there's also the possibility of compromised service. And what I mean here is either shirking, intentionally not carrying out orders in a correct way, pretending to misunderstand them, or it could also be selective compliance, carrying out some orders but not others, or not fully carrying out orders. Soldiers can also exit or desert. They can go AWOL, they can simply remain in their barracks when they're called up, they can go into exile. Another option is outright disobedience. And I want to clarify the difference in my thinking between outright disobedience and mutiny or defection. In outright disobedience, what security forces do is they basically withdraw from the conflict. They refuse to cooperate with the state, but they don't side with the movement. They neutralize themselves. With defections or mutiny, this entails cutting ties with the state, but then casting their allegiance and their support with the movement. And I'm going to argue that that last option is the one that has the potential to create these other problems. What I do is I look at 4 cases then to look at different responses that the security forces have taken and the effects that it has not only on the likelihood of ousting a regime, but the chances after the conflict in terms of consolidating democracy. So I look at 4 cases, Tunisia in 2011, and I argue that this is an example of outright disobedience. I also look at Serbia in 2000, the movement to oust President Slobodan Milosevic, and here I'm arguing what they did was basically selective compliance. And then I take 2 cases of defections, the Philippines in 1986 and Egypt in 2011, and I look at some of the consequences of the movement siding with of the security forces siding with the movement. Now, obviously, I can't go through 4 cases. I only have 20 minutes, and historians would wince if I tried to do that. So what I want to do is just highlight what the military did in each of these cases and argue that some of these are preferable for a movement than others. So let's start with Tunisia. We all know the instance of Tunisia the uprising began in December of 2010 when a young vegetable vendor had his cart confiscated, and when he tried to get it back, he wasn't able to do so. And out of desperation and protest of the dire economic circumstances, he set himself on fire. And within days, there were tens of thousands of Tunisians in the street protesting, followed by general strikes. And the president of Tunisia, Ben Ali, sent out the police to try to bring the situation under control, but the police were not able to do it. So then he called up the army, and by some accounts, he ordered the army to use whatever means necessary, including opening fire on protesters. But as this account goes, the military said, we won't do it. And in fact, what they did instead was they withdrew from the capital and went back to the borders where they had been stationed. Ben Ali tries a few more things, making concessions. It doesn't work. He eventually capitulates and flees the country. Now, there's another account that says Ben Ali never actually ordered the military to open fire on protesters. And there are now some interviews with military leaders where they say, we did not receive those orders, but if we had, we would not have followed them. And this indicates that this isn't defections, this is just a withholding of their cooperation. It's outright disobedience. And the effect of it, I'm going to quote a couple of analysts here, is that the neutrality of the army was a key element that led the revolution to overturn the Ben Ali regime. It wasn't the role of the army to overthrow Ben Ali, but they did not intervene, and there was a chance for the people to do it for themselves. And a second person said, to bring the regime to the end, the military had only to decline to uphold the status quo, which is precisely what it did. Now, after Ben Ali fled, we have this transition to democracy, and what's interesting is the role that the military took during that phase. It publicly came out and said, all we are going to do is provide stability so that elections can occur. We have no political role. Our job is basically to keep things calm so that civil society groups and civilian leaders can begin the election process in implementing a new system. And this is actually very consistent with the Tunisian military history, in which they've always seen themselves as a professional, depoliticized institution that's independent of the regime's interests. Now, let me quickly go on to the case of Serbia and the effort to remove President Slobodan Milosevic. This was a movement that started in the early 90s. It failed. They regrouped in the late 1990s, and they came up with a different strategy. The basic strategy was, let's pressure the state to hold elections, and then anticipating that Milosevic would try to steal the elections, we'll implement a series of civil resistance campaigns to highlight that fraud and bring in international observers and call for new elections that can then be free and fair. And so they began organizing, trying to expose the fraudulent activity and corruption that was going on. Eventually, in the summer of 2000, Milosevic did announce that he was going to hold elections. He announced in July that elections would happen 2 months later. And it was very intentional. He thought if it was a fast election, he would be able to clinch victory because the opposition wouldn't have time to organize. But the movement had been preparing for this, and so they were able to quickly organize. And they engaged in a variety of actions, but the culminating action was to, well, when the election happened, in fact, they had independent pollsters who said, our opposition candidate has received over 50% of the vote and is therefore the legitimate winner. Milosevic, of course, cited state polls that indicated there was no candidate that had the majority and therefore a runoff election was needed. They believed this was fraudulent, and so they called for a series of actions culminating in a call for Serbians to come to Belgrade, the capital, and to nonviolently occupy the parliament until Milosevic would resign. During this time, they had conversations with security forces, with the police and the military, but they really didn't know how they would respond. And they did not ask them to defect. They were hoping that they would just not repress the movement. So on this day when everyone's convening in Belgrade, nobody knew what to anticipate. And what happened is the military did call up their troops, mobilized them to the outskirts of the city, and they put up some barricades to stop people from coming in the city. But it was a real half-hearted attempt, and when people came to dismantle the barricades, they didn't stop them. It was shirking, basically. And then when they got to Belgrade and wanted to enter the parliament, the police made no effort to stop them. So this is really selective compliance. And in fact, that campaign was the impetus that got Milosevic to resign. But again, what I'm interested in is what happened after Milosevic left and they began to try to implement democracy. It was not a smooth or easy process, and within a couple years, it was clear that there were very deep divisions among opposition political leaders that culminated in failed elections and actually the assassination of the Serbian prime minister. And there are lots of reasons why democracy did not smoothly get implemented in Serbia, but in my analysis, one of the contributing factors was the fact that they did not do this constructive program of transforming the military. So they ended up with the exact same set of political leaders, or military and police leaders, that Milosevic had used, and they continued this repressive culture. And so one Serbian politician said, we made the mistake to not replace the most prominent persons from the police, the secret police, the army secret police, and the army general headquarters. They continued to knit their net, and after some time we came to the stage where everything is the same, only Milosevic is missing. So there was no transformation of the military in that post-conflict stage. Let me move on to the Philippines, perhaps the best known and most widely cited case of a nonviolent revolution. And this happened in 1986 when over 1 million Filipinos gathered to try and call for the resignation of Ferdinand Marcos, who, much like his Serbian counterpart, had rigged the election and tried to declare himself the legitimate presidential leader of the country. And his opposition candidate, Corazon Aquino, had said, none of us believe this. All the evidence is that the election was fraudulent. So we're going to embark on a series of civil resistance campaigns. And it was a very strategic plan. We had included tax resistance and boycotts and general strikes. But before any of these things could really be fully implemented, there was a pivotal event that transformed the situation. And that is that two high-ranking military officers went on television and announced that they could no longer support the regime. They were defecting in a very public way. And everyone knew at that moment that they were in jeopardy. And so the head of the Philippine Catholic Church put out a call for civilians to go down to the army base and protect these two defectors. And within 24 hours, 1 million people showed up for that purpose. And you all probably know how things unfolded from here. Marcos was furious, sent out his troops in tanks and said, disperse the crowds by any means necessary. And the troops went down in their tanks. They announced, you have 30 minutes to leave. After 30 minutes transpired, nobody moved. They were faced with a moral dilemma. Do we go ahead and crack down on these people, kill these people, even though there are children in the crowd, there are elderly people, there are nuns, there are priests, these are unarmed individuals, and many of them just couldn't bring themselves to carry out those orders. So they literally were climbing out of the tanks and joining the crowd. And within a 4-day span, there's an estimate that between 80 and 90% of the soldiers defected. Marcos realized he had no power to enforce his rule, and he fled. But even though this is seen as a very important moment that helped the movement achieve their goal, what we can see in the post-conflict stage is that democracy in the Philippines was very, very fragile. And in fact, Mark Thompson, who wrote one of the leading books on the Philippine People Power movement, said the most serious challenge faced by Aquino, the new president, came from her erstwhile revolutionary partners, the military rebels. Because in the first few years after the People Power movement, what happened is there were 8 different attempted coups. And this is what I'm arguing, that when there's a defection, the military sees itself as a political actor, that it has the right, perhaps it's their role, to help overturn a political leader that they do not see as appropriate to be in office. But we have the Egyptian case. Again, the Arab Spring case from 2011, in which Egyptians came out by hundreds of thousands demanding the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak. And in fact, Hosni Mubarak also called out the police and the military and asked them to use repression to stop the movement, and the military refused. The military, in some cases, were actually protecting protesters from the police. And they not only refused, but they said, we support the revolutionary movement. We're going to help them in their goal. So Mubarak flees, they try to implement democracy, but what we see very quickly is that the military does not step out of its political role. In fact, for over a year, the military had the political leadership in the country and even gave themselves constitutional powers. So eventually, after about a year, they bend to the pressure of the population to have civilian multi-party elections. And those elections, of course, led to Mohamed Morsi becoming president. And very quickly, people became disillusioned with Morsi's leadership for good reason. And after about a year, there was a new movement that said, we want him out. So this Tamarod campaign basically said, what we're going to do is collect signatures of a no-confidence vote in Morsi's leadership and to call for new elections. Within 2 months, they gathered 22 million signatures, and they began to say, we want him to step down right now. And after series and series of demonstrations, the civil resistance leadership came out and said, we want the police and the army to help us oust Morsi, and they complied. So in the summer of 2013, the military did help to depose Morsi, and civil resistors were in the street chanting, the people and the army are one. Now we know since Morsi was deposed, there have been elections, but there's ongoing conflict in Egypt, and one cannot classify it as a democracy. So let me quickly then talk about what we can conclude from these cases. Back to my central argument here, outright disobedience and selective compliance is, in this analysis, preferable to defections because it avoids some of these post-conflict problems when the military sides with the movement. And secondly, that's point argument one and argument one again. But the second argument there is that civil resistors really need to combine constructive program with protest if they want to build long-term successful democratization. So what would the constructive program look like vis-a-vis security forces? How would you transform these kinds of institutions? I argue that there are four components that are essential to transforming the security forces into an institution that could be supportive of democracy. One is that civil resistors need to redefine the military's mission to defending borders and humanitarian relief efforts. So this is consistent with what Gene Sharp called defensive defense, really just protecting the civilian population and its borders. Secondly, the military needs to be redesigned to be a strictly professional institution, not a political one. It has to be redefined that they do not have a political role, that their role is not dependent on the regime's interests. Third, security forces need to be unambiguously under civilian control. And fourth, it's important to replace personnel in key leadership positions to ensure that the old practices and cultures are eliminated. Now, interestingly, if you look or read the paper and look at these four cases, nobody did the constructive program. So I'm arguing that this is essential, but nobody engaged in it. And I have some explanations, at least some thoughts about why that might be. But the Tunisian case is interesting. There was not a constructive program, but the Tunisian case fits these criteria. Historically, they'd already seen themselves this way. Independently, the military came out and said, we are under civilian control. So in many ways, they already embodied this kind of vision of an alternative military. And I'm arguing that's part of the reason why that transition process has been more stable and successful than some of the other ones. Now, what does this have to do with social movement scholars? So part of this conference is to try and help bridge the divides between these two fields of study and to promote dialogue. And you might be thinking, well, I study social movements. They're not trying to overthrow the state. The military doesn't seem to even matter here. What relevance does this have to the field of the study of social movements? I think yesterday Kurt Schock did a very nice description of how our fields have largely developed in parallel ways, but different at the same time. So the field of nonviolent studies or civil resistance studies has largely studied movements in authoritarian regimes that have the goal of overturning the system. And social movement studies have largely looked at movements in democracies that often are more reform-oriented. So you might think these are just completely different and there's not a lot of relevance. But I think there are important points that can influence our thinking about domestic or social movements and democracies. And the two movements that come to mind for me are the sanctuary movement that we see happening right now and Black Lives Matter movement. The sanctuary movement that is happening all over the United States right now is really aimed to protect undocumented immigrants from being deported. And what we've seen happening is campus police in various cities throughout the country have independently said, we're not going to enforce these rules to ask about people's legal status. We're not going to ask if they're undocumented. We're not going to prosecute them and deport them. We're simply not going to do that. And they're saying this even under threats from the Trump administration to withhold federal funding from them. So this is obviously really benefiting the movement to have the police not even carrying out orders to ask about this. So thinking about what the police role can be in this movement, I think is relevant to those studying the sanctuary movement. And also with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think there's a role to come back to Gandhi to say, we've missed something in not paying attention to the constructive program. Clearly, the Black Lives Matter movement has a lot to say about the injustices within our police departments and the culture of policing in the United States. And they are doing a fantastic job of pointing out all the problems that exist that have culminated in brutality against communities of color. But I have heard less about the vision of what kind of police departments would be different. How can we reconfigure or re-envision and transform our police departments to be departments that truly protect these communities rather than threaten them? So I do think that there's much to be learned, and that I hope we have an ongoing conversation between nonviolent studies or civil resistance studies and scholars who study social movements. That's it.